Hello and welcome to another episode of The Candid Fitness, a podcast where I share my learning through personal stories and also invite guests to talk about their stories or share their expertise on all things fitness, which includes physical health, nutrition, workouts, mental health, self-discipline, and much more. In this episode, I chat with Dr. Jayati Dureja, a practicing gynecologist and obstetrician with a special interest in maternal-fetal medicine and prenatal genetics. We discussed in depth about polycystic ovary syndrome, commonly known as PCOS, and I cannot thank Dr. Jayati enough for having this conversation. PCOS is widespread, affecting women not just in India but all over the world, and there is still very little awareness about this. If you find this episode useful, I request you to please share it with as many people as possible. Who knows, someone in need may find this. We have discussed some of the commonly asked questions and debunked the myths, and Dr. Jayati was kind enough to make it as simple as possible so all of us can understand this. I hope this conversation would be as valuable for you as it was for me. If you enjoy this, please leave us a 5-star review on iTunes. It would mean a lot to us. Now, without further delay, come join us and enjoy this candid conversation. Welcome back, everyone. Thank you so much for listening. We have Dr. Jayati Dureja with us today. Jayati, welcome and thank you so much for being here. How are you?
Thank you for having me on your podcast, Abhimanyu. I'm doing well. Thank you.
So I'll directly get on to the basics. So we're talking about PCOS here, and I want to understand what are the common symptoms of PCOS? How does somebody get to understand that, okay, I am suffering from something known as PCOS?
Okay. So PCOS, it's called polycystic ovarian syndrome. And like we were talking about earlier, is it a syndrome? Is it a disease? When does a syndrome become a disease? There's a thin line between that. So as far as the syndrome goes, it means it hasn't started affecting the person's life in a medically adverse way, but there are some symptoms which would make me categorize that patient into the syndrome. So we have something called the Rotterdam criteria, in which we say that if the person meets 2 out of 3 symptoms, we can label that person as a PCOS. So the first thing is that there should be menstrual irregularities. Which basically means that normally most women would have periods every 28 to 30 days or a monthly cycle. So when a person doesn't have them every month, it's happening every 6 weeks, every 8 weeks, every 3 months. That would be the topmost symptom, and that is something a girl or a woman notices immediately, that okay, it's not happening on time for me, so something is wrong. The second would be signs of increased androgen secretion in the body, which would be in the form of acne or male pattern hair growth on the face or on the arms, on the belly, more of a coarse hair. And in very severe cases, because of excess androgens or excess testosterone, these women will even start having hair fall or balding the way men have who have excess testosterone. And the third is something that a woman can't assess on her own, and that is to see polycystic ovaries on an ultrasound. So if somebody hasn't got a scan done and they have the first 2 symptoms, and they come to me, I would straight away tell them it sounds like you have PCOS. But because 2 3 diseases mimic PCOS, like there's a testosterone producing tumor in the adrenals, and there's a testosterone producing cyst or a tumor in the ovaries. So I would always want to run a blood test to check the testosterone levels, and maybe even an ultrasound to make sure it's not a tumor which is causing these symptoms of menstrual irregularities and acne and hirsutism. And once those are ruled out, which are very dangerous conditions, then I would want to concentrate on the remaining symptoms being because of PCOS. So, coming back to the Rotterdam criteria, which asks for 2 symptoms. The first symptom being signs of excess androgen, that is acne or hirsutism. second being menstrual irregularity. These are the two symptoms clinically which I can observe. And the third would be an investigation, which would be the ultrasound, which would show polycystic ovaries on scan.
All right. So, what causes PCOS? Is it genetic, or there are certain environmental or external factors that lead to PCOS?
So PCOS causes is something that is still under research, as we were talking about, and it's very difficult to pinpoint one reason as to why somebody would have gotten these symptoms or would have become a PCOS. There are environmental as well as genetic factors, and in some ways, I would like to draw a parallel to how type 2 diabetes is, because it's very similar, and it's more common for people to know about type 2 diabetes. They know that, okay, if I've been eating a lot of junk, I can get type 2 diabetes. If I've been eating unhealthy, I've not been exercising. And a lot of these people do have family history of diabetes. So they know that, okay, my mother or grandfather had diabetes. So if I'm careful, if I'm exercising, if I'm taking care of my diet, if I avoid sugars, then I could delay the onset of diabetes, or I could completely avoid having diabetes. So it's a multifactorial syndrome, and that is why in a lot of people, I won't be able to pinpoint to any one particular cause, whether it's environmental or genetic. We do get a lot of patients who are thin, who are really good with their diet and exercise routines. They don't have any lifestyle issue as such, but they still have these symptoms. And in those patients, I can't sort of advise them that, oh, you have a lifestyle issue and that's why you've got PCOS. So I have to look at other things. Another environmental cause is stress, lack of sleep. Then there are other things like vitamin D deficiency, vitamin B12 deficiency. And alone, these are, not solely responsible. They would be causing a lot of changes at the cellular level, and one of the changes could be PCOS. So, just like diabetes is both partly genetic and partly environment based, PCOS is almost the same. In fact, PCOS is also seen in a lot of people who have family history of diabetes.
So is PCOS and diabetes linked in some way?
Yeah, the most common pathology behind both diabetes and PCOS is insulin resistance, and it's since it's common in both. We've also observed that a lot of women who get PCOS, if they do not make lifestyle changes, if they do not improve their diet and start exercising, they do end up becoming diabetic in the next decade or so. So that's another reason why I was comparing the causes of PCOS with diabetes, because the root cause is thought to be the same. And also because PCOS is a relatively new syndrome or a new term, and diabetes is an older term. We have seen that people who have family history of diabetes are getting PCOS now. So it's possible that their mothers or grandmothers did have PCOS, but they were never diagnosed with that entity because that entity did not exist at that point of time. And since PCOS causes decrease in fertility with age, and women used to get married and start their families at an earlier age, it's possible that by the time they got PCOS, they didn't have to, worry about fertility, or they didn't have to think too much about why their periods are getting irregular. So we don't know if the patient's mother or grandmother had symptoms of PCOS.
Okay, there's a common question that I've heard from a lot of women around fertility, that PCOS impacts fertility. And some of them also feel that if you are overweight or if you are very stressed in general in life, then it further impacts your fertility. So, what are your views on women with PCOS who are overweight, maybe stressed because of multiple reasons, and the impact of that on fertility?
So, fertility is a big topic in itself. And I think to understand how PCOS affects fertility and how PCOS affects periods, we have to understand what PCOS is at the level of ovaries. And to explain how both periods and fertility are affected, we first need to understand what is normal, what is a normal menstrual cycle, what is a normal period, and what is a normal sort of fertility that we expect in a woman who's menstruating regularly. I think how I would explain to like a layman about this would be that you can think of there are two organs which work with each other. Like, there's a big orchestra of hormones, and two organs have to work together to produce fertility and to produce periods on time. So the first is the ovaries, and the second would be the uterus. You can think of ovaries like the host and the uterus like the venue of a party. Okay. So the host is the one who plans everything out, like how I would decorate the venue, what all food would be ordered, and where all things would be placed at the venue, right? So that would be the uterus. Okay. And the host has to be really energetic, and has to sort of evolve the plans, and has to make a list that, okay, first we need this, then we need this, and gradually the party planning evolves, and at the end of the day you have a great party, right? So the ovary is like the host, and it's for the first 14 days it's making this sort of list, and it's sort of decorating the venue. In a normal woman, a menstrual cycle is 28 days. So the first 14 days, the host is getting everything ready, the venue and the, ordering the food and the catering. And for the next 14 days is like, everything is laid out, and now the host is for the next 2 days waiting for the party to happen. That would be the egg coming out of the ovary, and the first 14 days is the egg getting ready. Then for one day the egg comes out. It either gets fertilized or doesn't get fertilized. So the party happens or it doesn't happen. And if the party doesn't happen, then you have to throw out the food and you have to throw out all the decorations. So that is what a period is basically. So after 14 days, everything goes bad, and then the host has to sort of tell the uterus, okay, just throw everything out, or like has to arrange some people to come and remove all the decorations and the food from the venue. So this is a normal 28-day cycle that happens in every woman. And what happens in PCOS is that the host just keeps planning. It just never gets ready for the party to happen. So instead of 14 days, it's planning for 6 weeks, 7 weeks. Okay. And the venue just never gets ready fully. There's something always missing in the venue.
Right.
And so whatever is missing in the venue is what we doctors have to give from outside to make the venue complete. And in PCOS, what happens is the first 14 days in a normal cycle, the egg usually produces estrogen, and in the next 14 days, it produces progesterone, like relatively what is produced more. But in PCOS women, the egg is very small, it's not energetic enough, and it doesn't develop enough, it doesn't evolve enough to become ready for the party. So there are 3-4 people who are just thinking and planning, and they're not growing enough. So there's always a little bit of estrogen coming out, to the point where there's just a lot of estrogen in the woman's bloodstream, but there's no progesterone, because the egg hasn't matured enough to actually host the party and call people in. So that's what doctors do. We give progesterone from outside. And how this impacts the period and how it impacts fertility is that, as far as periods go, obviously, if the second part doesn't come in, which has to clear out the venue, there will never be a period. Like, it could be 6 weeks, it could be 8 weeks, it could be 6 months in some cases that a lady's not got her period.
What is the medical term for that time period that you're talking about?
the proliferative phase, and the luteal phase is the second half. So the proliferative phase is basically the estrogen coming in and just causing proliferation, or as I said, making the venue ready. And the luteal phase is the one which keeps the food stored for the, if the egg gets fertilizes and turns into a baby, then there's enough food for the baby.
Right. So that first phase becomes too long, and so you have to use something externally to make it fertile.
Yeah, make it fertile as well as to get a period also.
Okay, got it.
So, this is what reproductive endocrinology is. Like, do I want to give the woman a regular period? Has she not had a period for 3 months? So, I'll give her progesterone for just 10 days and make her get a period. If she wants to conceive, then I need to sort of, clear everything out from the venue first. So, I'll still give her progesterone for 10 days, make the venue clean again, and then I would give her some other medicines which would make her egg more active. And then in the second half, I would still give her progesterone from outside, because these eggs would not be able to make sufficient progesterone. So progesterone is to progestation. So I want that lady to get pregnant and maintain the pregnancy. So then I have to give her progesterone from outside. So it's not impossible for a woman with PCOS to get pregnant, but yes, she will need help, because her own hormones aren't able to balance this out. So she will need external help from us, where we can mimic the natural cycle in her by giving 3-4 different types of hormonal medications. And there are X specific medications for fertility, and then there are hormonal medications which are just for a woman to get her period on time, so she doesn't have to worry about, like, oh, I haven't got it for a month, I haven't got it for 2 months, when will I get it? When I'm at a party? Will I get it when I'm holidaying in Maldives or something? So she doesn't want that uncertainty. And also, a lot of women are constantly reminded by, when they don't get a period on time, they worry that, okay, something's not wrong with me. So that's another reason why we tend to, we assess the patient's need and how important getting that period is for her, and how well she understands this issue. So if it's someone who's not very literate and is just, not able to stop worrying about, I'm just not getting a period, just do anything, make me get a period every month, then I will give her hormonal regulation every month. So and advise her about lifestyle changes, because she wouldn't understand when I'm trying to tell her, okay, you don't have to worry if you don't get it for 2 months, and then when you don't get it for 2 months, come to me, I'll just give you progesterone so you get it. She doesn't want that. She wants, I shouldn't have to come to you, and every month on dot I should get my period like normal women do. So yeah, as far as fertility is concerned with PCOS, this is what I wanted to tell you. And fertility itself has a lot of, what do you say? Again, it's a multifactorial cause. There's genetics, there's age, there's underlying causes with the hormones like PCOS. Some women have excess prolactin. So there's a lot of different reasons. And yeah, obesity also does affect egg health. So that's a separate cause. It's not PCOS. PCOS alone will cause, changes to one's fertility, and being overweight will cause changes independently, and age will also independently affect fertility. And obviously, all three in one woman would compound the whole, fertility issue.
And does every woman who's diagnosed with PCOS need these hormones, or is it just certain severe cases where it's required? So what I'm trying to understand is that, okay, if somebody is diagnosed with PCOS once, does that mean they always have to take hormones after a certain period of time so that their periods get back to normal? And also, when they are planning to conceive.
So, like, coming back to the party explanation, basically, every woman has, say, about 1 million eggs in the ovary. and every month about 20 are recruited, and only one can become the egg producing, like the egg which will get released and get fertilized. So what happens to the other 19? The other 19 slowly, it's like 20 of them are competing for the same food and resources, but only one best egg will sort of outshine the others and become big enough to release. In PCOS, what happens is the same 20 eggs are trying to compete with each other, but all the 20 eggs, because of insulin resistance at the level of the egg, at the cellular level, they aren't getting the nutrition that they need, because there's glucose in the body and the glucose has to go inside the cell to push the cell to grow. But because of insulin resistance, the eggs are not able to grow. So what happens is all 20 eggs remain small. And that is what we see as poly. Poly means many. Cystic means these are actually small fluid-filled eggs in the ovary. So these are actually not cysts in the ovary. These are the eggs which have failed to mature, or one egg which has failed to mature, and all 20 of them have grown a little bit. And not a single egg has become the dominant egg. So it can happen in some cycles where the woman has been more active, or just by chance that one egg comes up which doesn't have the same level of insulin resistance as the others, and it grows and it becomes the dominant egg in a woman who normally has PCOS. And if she's been with her partner, just by chance, when this egg decided to become the dominant egg, she can conceive, because that egg did become dominant enough to come out. But in women who in whom this doesn't happen, or they've been trying for a while, so in those women we have to give certain injections or certain oral medicines to give that push to the egg to grow to that level. And then what we do is we check on the ultrasound, we check on the size of the egg every 2-3 days, and we know, okay, there are 2 or 3 eggs which have grown to the level that a normal good egg would grow. And then we give them an injection to make the egg release, and we tell them to be with their partner, and then we give them progesterone support for the pregnancy to continue. So that is the fertility treatment that we give to most PCOS women. They don't normally need a lot of injections. It's mostly oral medication, like most of them do well with that. So that's what is needed. The other question you asked me is, are hormones really needed for periods? There's a slightly scary answer to this, and that is that when the body has only estrogen as the main hormone in a lady, that estrogen can go and do some harm if it's not balanced out by progesterone every month. And it's a slow long-term harm, which is in the form of breast cancer and uterine cancer. So what we ideally tell women is that they should get at least 4 to 6 periods in a year, at least once in 2 months, which means they will require progesterone from outside to balance this estrogen out, so that there's no prolonged stimulation of the breast or the uterus with estrogen, which is a carcinogen if it is unbalanced. So that is the reason why we give hormones. It's not that I want the patient to become dependent on me and, she should keep coming to me, like, okay, once she's got PCOS, like now there's no other reason. And it's very difficult to tell an 18-year-old or a 25-year-old, I'm giving you hormones because if I don't, then, at the age of 40, you could get cancer. Ideally, we're supposed to tell them this, but if I tell a patient this in the first go, she won't come back to me.
So are there any natural ways to increase that progesterone level in the body so that the effect of estrogen gets nullified?
Honestly, no. I know you asked me about seed cycling, and I did read about, I think, flaxseed, pumpkin seeds. I don't like even remember watermelon seeds. There were 4 seeds given in the seed cycling. Flax seeds, I think, are higher in estrogen because that's what we advise in menopausal women because they're not making estrogen or progesterone. And estrogen is the reason why women have soft skin and, uh, a womanly curve and a supple glow, and all that sort of goes away in menopause. So we do tell them to take it from outside, what we call phytoestrogens or plant sources of estrogen. But as far as plant sources of progesterone go, nothing has been found to be effective enough. Even estrogen is not effective enough. It's just something you can take on the side. It may or may not help. And then the amount that one would need, the amount of seeds one would need to eat to do this, would be so much that what are these pharma companies doing? They're pretty much extracting progesterone and estrogen from a lot of these sources. Like, what is allopathic medicine? It is, we find that a certain plant or a certain organism is making this product really well, and then we amplify that, we purify that, and we put it in a small pill and we give it to you. It is semi synthetic, yes, because we've enhanced and amplified it, but that's what we're giving you. We're not giving you like, no chemical is made from thin air in the lab, right? Like, we have a template from a plant source or from some herb that we use, and that is what progesterone, and that is the progesterone pill that we are giving. And there's a very interesting story as to how progesterone was discovered, and how the first few endocrinologists went to Mexico to look for this one herb that was giving the best, yield of progesterone per unit. So it's not that I don't know why allopathy's got such a bad name, that, oh, we are going for naturopathy. We are giving you the same thing. We're just super concentrating and super purifying and making sure, like, the other bad stuff doesn't get into the same pill. Like, a lot of Ayurvedic or a lot of naturopathy is going to have, because it's not purified, there are going to be other components that you end up taking which will have some other effects in your body. And if you take it in that much quantity, like, anything you take in too much quantity is not going to be good. So as far as natural sources go, I wouldn't recommend them because it's really not feasible. Plus, we don't know the other side effects that would come from it on other organs.
And does the body create those hormones itself in larger quantities on its own, or do you always have to? Because a lot of places I've read that people say that PCOS can be managed by lifestyle changes, by exercising, by eating right. So what does that mean? I'm trying to understand that if you always need to go to a doctor and get some hormones injected, then what does
No, no.
managing what does managing PCOS through lifestyle mean?
Okay. What does managing PCOS through lifestyle mean? Basically, the majority of PCOS that we do see are overweight women. These are women who are stressed out, so they're not, eating home cooked meals. They're eating a lot of processed food. They're like picking up a packet of biscuits or chips on the way, or eating some easily available fried food, or having Coke, or there is definitely something wrong with the way that they're eating. Or if they've modified recently, there was something wrong with the way they were eating in the past, which led them to this point of insulin resistance. So when we say lifestyle can help you control it, we are talking about the insulin resistance part, which is how a lot of women, not women, a lot of people are able to get over diabetes, or when they make lifestyle changes, they say, okay, I used to need insulin, now I don't need insulin anymore. I'm able to control my diabetes with diet alone. So this is how it's the same principle that applies to PCOS. So when a lady is able to exercise more, sleep better, have less stress, and have the right diet, which is going to be low in carbohydrate and higher in protein, and also take all the vitamin supplements that are needed. Like vitamin D has recently been found to be very, very important for egg health. Then the insulin resistance at the level of the ovary comes down. And when that comes down, the egg is able to grow naturally instead of needing those external stimuli to grow. And when it grows naturally, it will come out after, if not after 2 weeks, then after 3 weeks it will get released. When it gets released, the leftover part in the ovary is what produces progesterone, the leftover part of the egg. So as long as that doesn't happen, the ovary of that person won't produce progesterone. And it's as simple as that. So if someone's not ovulated for 3 weeks, 4 weeks, 6 weeks, progesterone is something that starts getting made in the body after ovulation. So then, how will that person make progesterone in her own body? So,
You're saying making lifestyle changes will improve the ovulation
yes.
process, and as a result of that, excess estrogen won't be created, and therefore you don't need hormones afterwards.
Yes, because what are the hormones we're giving? We're giving, to some women, we're giving estrogen plus progesterone combination daily for 21 days. And in others, we're letting their own body make the estrogen for the first 2, 3 weeks. And then in the last week, we're giving progesterone to balance out the estrogen which is already being made in her body. For this, the woman has to be really well educated and understand that, okay, my body is making one hormone, but not the other. So I'll go to my doctor if like the whole month is gone and I haven't got my period, then it's okay. I don't mind going to the doctor, taking the other hormone and getting my period. So you have to look at it like a deficiency. Like if someone has a thyroid deficiency, they have to take it from outside. So women with PCOS have a progesterone deficiency and estrogen excess. So it's like the weighing scales are tilted against their favor.
So you're saying the root cause is in a way insulin resistance.
Yes.
And if you can tackle that, in effect, you are able to tackle everything that happens afterwards.
Yes. So PCOS basically is a combination of, we know that there is chronic inflammation in the body in PCOS, and we know there is insulin resistance. But what causes chronic inflammation and what causes insulin resistance is multifactorial. So it's like A leads to B leads to C. We know B and we know C, but the A is multifold and it's genetic also and it's environmental also. So genetics we can't control, the environment we can control. So that's what we advise women. And the other thing is it takes time. If anyone is trying to lose weight, if anyone's trying to make a lifestyle change, it takes time, and that time can be quite very demotivating for some women. So we do start them on the hormone pill while they make lifestyle changes, and then slowly, decrease that hormone pill for them, so that when we've noticed that they've made efforts or they're really making lifestyle changes. And then there are some patients who just come to us and they're like, nahi hota. Like, just give me a pill. Then what can I do? Yeah.
I think for them, you're right that not everyone makes an effort to understand, but the way you explained me the host and how insulin resistance affects ovulation, and because of that, excess estrogen is created, and therefore you need external progesterone. If somebody understands that, then it makes sense that you have to, if you can tackle the insulin resistance part, and I know it all looks easy in theory, but I'm sure there are multiple things related to it. But if you can tackle the insulin resistance part by having an active lifestyle and a healthy diet, the other things can be tackled in a natural manner rather than getting those hormones externally. Because I'm guessing that those external hormones will also have some side effects, right?
Yeah, slight. Every medicine has side effects. Even eating too much butter has side effects. Eating too much ghee has side effects. Ghee is so good.
Right. Got it.
So
I've also heard a lot of women say that they were put on birth control pills.
yeah.
Why is that required?
So these are the hormone pills. They are birth control pills.
Oh, so they are called birth control pills.
Actually, birth control pills are basically a combination of estrogen and progesterone in the same pill. And what we do is when we give these pills, we fool the brain into thinking that the ovary is making these hormones. So the brain stops. So the brain has to tell the ovary every month to grow the egg and make some hormones. So the brain just assumes, oh, there's enough down there, so I don't need to tell the ovary anymore. So gradually, when you're eating it, the brain can't make out the source of it. Like, is it coming from the ovary or is it coming from something you're eating? So the brain kind of stops telling the ovary to grow the egg. And that is why it's a birth control pill, because if a woman doesn't make the egg, then she won't get pregnant. But in PCOS, how we use this is that these women are making only estrogen, they're not making progesterone. So by silencing their ovaries a little bit and giving the estrogen and progesterone from outside, we are able to control what's happening with the venue, with the party venue. The estrogen, progesterone, all the party preparations are coming from outside, and the guests are coming and they're going without the host having to do anything. So we are protecting the uterus by giving a birth control pill, and we are protecting the breasts indirectly, and we are giving some psychological satisfaction to the lady that she's getting a period every month just like other normal women. So there are three benefits to it. Another added benefit to this birth control pill is that even birth control pills have sort of really, the research about what estrogen and what progesterone is to be put in these pills has evolved a lot over the last few decades, and now we have a type of progesterone which will decrease the acne in these women, which will decrease new hair growth in these women. So if someone has PCOS and she's, it's a teenager and she doesn't want to, get embarrassed in her school because of the acne and the hair growth, and she doesn't want to be surprised by her period sitting in the middle of a class, then this would be an ideal candidate for this kind of a birth control pill, which specifically decreases acne and decreases hair growth on the face. So it is therapeutic also in a way. So if I get a candidate with all these symptoms, I would put her on these pills because of the acne and the hair issue, not just the periods issue, because she will anyway need external progesterone every 2 months or every 6 weeks. If at least she's understood that part, then I'll tell her, okay, if it doesn't bother you, you come to me every 4 to 6 weeks, I'll give you progesterone. So, but that won't help with her acne and it won't help with her, facial hair and stuff. So I would give her the birth control pills with specific anti-acne and anti-hirsutism action.
Okay. We also discussed something around dysbiosis of gut microbiota. What is
How
that?
did you come across this?
So I just read it. I think first time I came across this in one of the podcasts. I think it was your podcast.
Yeah, I spoke about it last time. Yeah.
Yes. And then I also heard about it in another PCOS podcast that I was listening to. And I was like, this term is familiar. So then I read up about it. And then I was like, this is something that I should discuss with you because clearly there seems to be some link between PCOS and gut microbiota.
Because this is a relatively new area of research, and I think only in the last decade we are sort of concentrating on nutrition. Because initially, when allopathy or most of our courses, like MBBS or MD, they were more focused on treatment. We weren't focused on prevention so much, and we weren't sort of so focused on advising patients to, how they could go about things without needing medicines, or how it might take a while, and just through some natural sources or through some lifestyle changes you could get rid of the disease. So this area of research has come up in the last 10 years, and this theory called dogma, dysbiosis of gut microbiota, is a very new paper. I've come across it only in this year, and it will get a bit technical. I don't know to what extent I should explain this. Basically, it's another theory which explains why PCOS happens, and it's a theory which is able to, for the first time, explain all aspects of PCOS. But it's a theory, like, as to why PCOS is happening. So, as I told you, we know about A to B to C, right? Like C is PCOS. The mid step is chronic inflammation and insulin resistance. And then A is what is causing chronic inflammation and what is causing insulin resistance. We don't know. So, this is a very elegant explanation which tries to pinpoint the A, what is causing chronic inflammation and what is causing insulin resistance. So, we have some good bacteria in our gut, which prevents the growth of bad bacteria, and it sort of takes all the waste product that we have by the time it reaches the colon, and it ferments that, and it produces certain vitamins and certain products which are good for the gut and which are anti-inflammatory. There are some bad bacteria which have an inherent quality of activating the immune system in our body if they enter our bloodstream. So the idea is that this bad bacteria should never grow enough, and it should never grow enough to invade from the gut into our bloodstream and cause inflammation. So most of the refined foods, sugars, processed foods have been identified to cause inflammation in the body or gut inflammation. So what this is that it doesn't let the good bacteria grow, and it causes an increase in the bad bacteria. Plus, it makes this barrier in the gut, which is supposed to keep all types of bacteria out and not let them enter, or their products enter the bloodstream. This inflammation, or this sort of, it attacks the barrier and makes it leaky. Once the gut becomes leaky, the bad bacteria and their bad products enter the bloodstream, and they trigger a cascade of inflammation in the body. And this inflammation increases adipose tissue. This inflammation causes insulin resistance, not just at the level of ovaries, at the level of muscles, at the level of a lot of other organs. And obviously, once inflammation and insulin resistance starts, then you'll get PCOS, you'll get diabetes. This is the short explanation to it. That there are things in our diet which cause the gut to become leaky and cause inflammation. That's the gist of it. So we should really avoid all processed foods and white sugar if we don't want to cause a leaky gut and we don't want inflammation in the body. So that could help. Like, that's the part where diet comes into the picture.
And that dogma theory says that if somebody's eating those kind of food on a regular basis, there are chances that the microbiota or the microorganisms that are present in that person's gut, which is a mix of good and bad, that ratio will get affected, and there will be more bad bacteria in their gut, and therefore it may lead to chronic inflammation and insulin resistance.
Yes, because inflammation is affecting the insulin receptor, which is there at the cellular level. So each cell has like a special door for insulin, and that is called an insulin receptor. And once inflammation starts, it sort of bolts that door shut. And whenever insulin comes into a cell, it brings glucose, and glucose is needed for the cell by the mitochondria to generate energy to do all its functions. So then it doesn't get that energy, and then it's the cell is not able to function to its maximum.
So the earlier you understand that, the better it is for you. It pretty much feels like they should have this in school curriculums, and they should teach these to school kids that, why you shouldn't eat a lot of processed food, why they should be focused on whole foods and less processed meals, why you should reduce your sugar intake.
I cannot even, I mean, I think after just studying for my entire life, like at the age of 28, 29 is when I stopped studying. And in the last 1.5 year, I'm just thinking, oh my God, did they teach us anything of use? Like, they didn't teach us finances, they didn't teach us how to figure out like banking, how to do savings, how to eat right. Did what, like I don't even remember. I topped in history, I topped in almost every subject, or like I did very well. I don't remember shit.
It's not applied. There's no practical application of that unless you're doing a job in that.
I went to Europe and I couldn't recall anything from the World War stuff that I had like read and enjoyed back in ninth grade. And I was just wondering that, like, what do we remember from school? Like, I wish they had just taught us something practical, like how to grow plants, how to handle our finances, how to. I wish they taught less, but whatever they taught was of use, because as science students, they make us feel so glorified that, oh, you're the intelligent ones, oh, you're doing so well, you'll do fine in life. But at the end of the day, we're just sort of taught to get into the system and get into a job and just like join the workforce. And over the last 1 year, I'm just like, why, what should I do with that? How is that going to make me happy? Or I don't know anything. Like, why did they not teach us nutrition? Even at MBBS levels, we were just taught like, the chemical structure of fats or the chemical structure of proteins, but we weren't taught like what is keto, or how you can modify your diet to gain weight, to lose weight, to improve diseases. We're not taught any of that. And even when we do masters, even if you're talking about like we have a lot of patients who get diabetes in pregnancy, and most of the time our curriculum is focused on what is the medicine that I can give to this lady. Like, I know I have to give her lifestyle advice, but that's just in a few paragraphs. And because I have interest, I really went deeper into it, and my mentors did have interest in that, so they really did promote us to go into it. But I have peers who can't give the same nutritional advice that I can give, because they were just taught, okay, just give metformin, just give insulin. You tell them to walk or something, but how will they walk? Oh, and they're already feeling uncomfortable. What diet control can they do? They're pregnant, they need to eat. I'm like, no, they can. Like, you tell them to eat more salads.
You have to give the right direction and some sort of a structure.
Yeah, or if you can't give it, you send them to a nutritionist who will be able to do it. But neither is the patient willing. I think I've told 4 patients in the last week to take separate nutritional counseling from me for their diabetes. They've not shown up. So because I can't give the nutritional information without
Understanding the whole
my
history.
way is to understand. Yeah, I need to understand what kind of food is made in your house, what are you used to, and I'm going to tweak that. I'm not just going to suddenly tell you have avocado toast in the morning. Like,
It has to be sustainable, because if you give some random suggestion which they don't do on a daily basis, after leaving your counseling, they'll again go back to their old habits. So
exactly. I can't tell them to have some exotic stuff, or I can't tell some low socioeconomic strata lady to start eating almonds and, like something that she can't afford, like go eat broccoli. I can't do that.
from a nutritional perspective, do you have any suggestions or tips for people who have been diagnosed with PCOS in terms of how do they get started once they've been diagnosed, or if they've been diagnosed for a while and their doctor have asked them to either lose weight or start eating healthier, or make some changes to their lifestyle?
Where to get started? If that patient can
Thank you so much for listening. If you've come this far, I'm sure you must have learned a lot already. We will continue this conversation in our next episode, in which we discuss PCOS nutrition and some practical ways to possibly manage PCOS. If you're looking for a health coach, someone who can help you integrate fitness and nutrition into your lifestyle, please head to my website abhimanyubhargav.com and check out one-on-one online coaching, or feel free to message me on Instagram. The links are provided in show notes. If you enjoyed this episode, please spare a few seconds to leave us a 5-star review on iTunes. It'll mean a lot to us. I hope you learned something new today. And speaking of learnings, be sure to subscribe to this podcast, and I'll see you in next episode. Until then, take care and be awesome.